especially those who I just spoke to, who don't remember this happening because it happened before you were even born. And some of you who we wouldn't even think weren't born then, weren't born yet. But how many of you who were alive at the time remember the year 1999? Do you remember how we all were a little anxious about what was going to happen when 2000 came, when the new millennium appeared? We were all asking, what is the world going to look like? We had this fear that the technology wouldn't be able to handle the new millennium. Remember what would happen when the computer tried to turn to it? Would it happen? Would things just explode? Would time just stop? How many of you remember that? Did any of you have that kind of anxiety or fear or uncertainty? You're not willing to admit it if you did. Well, when I was growing up, many New Year's Eve parties were hosted at my aunt and uncle's house. We would celebrate Christmas on that day with that side of the family. So we would, on New Year's Eve, have a big meal together, and then we would play lots and lots of games until it got to a few minutes before midnight, and like many people do, we then would crowd around the TV in their living room, and we would watch the ball drop in Times Square and do the whole countdown together, right, from 10. Well, the celebration into the year 2000 was quite eventful in my aunt and uncle's house, because as the countdown started, my uncle was standing in the back of the room, and he conveniently noticed that the light switches to all of the lights that were on in the house at that time were right next to him. And then he also saw that the remote was really close to him, so he just slyly picked it up. And right as you all know where this is going, in a stroke of genius, right as the countdown ended and everyone was ready to say, Happy New Year, he cut off the lights and the TV at the very same time. And there was this gasp across the room, right? It really happened. What we feared happened. The predictions were true. Our technology couldn't keep up with all of this. We didn't think, of course, all these other countries and different time zones have already moved into 2000 perfectly fine. The world revolves around Eastern Standard Time, right? And then, as soon as we were thinking about all of that, Uncle Craig said, just kidding, and put the lights up and the TV back on. But it was one of the greatest pranks of all time, seriously. Sometimes I wonder, do I remember that happening, or do I just remember the story being told so often because it was so good? But it was a disruption, right? It was such a disruption to the normal celebration that we were going to have, saying Happy New Year, and then everything just cutting off. I wonder if there are other times in your life where you have experienced a disruption. Some disruptions are small. Conversations that happen between my husband and I during the waking hours of our children are often disrupted because our 5-year-old has a huge desire for attention, and our toddler has a desire to explore places in our home that he shouldn't explore. So conversations, while they are awake, are hard to fully happen. But other disruptions can be major, right? There are some pastors right now in this season, not the season of Lent, but in our denomination, we're in the season of moves happening, moves being announced. And so many pastors in this season will get a phone call saying, you're being moved to this church, disrupting your whole life, right? That happened a year ago. I'm not anticipating it happening now, so just don't think that I'm going in that direction. But it disrupts the pastor's life and the life of the congregation. There was also a movie I watched once with a character who thought that she was pregnant, went to the doctor's office full of hope about this new baby in her life, only to find out that instead of a baby growing inside her, a tumor was growing inside of her, right? A huge disruption in her life. Other times, disruptions can take the form of disagreements. Sometimes someone might question your belief system or your ideologies, and so it disrupts your whole worldview and how you thought things were meant to be. And oftentimes, there are conversations that we avoid because of the disruption it could mean for your relationships. Well, our scripture today is about another disruption that Jesus creates right in the middle of the temple. You heard me talk with the kids about it just now, but I want to read to you right from the Gospel of John. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews said to them, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So John's timing of this scripture is 3 years ahead of our other gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where the same story is written. In the other gospels, Jesus flips over these tables, just like he does here, right outside of the temple in Jerusalem, and he wreaks havoc right before, though, he is arrested and crucified. And that makes a lot of sense because something like this would give the religious leaders the right kind of ammunition to bring Jesus up on charges. But John writes this story at the beginning of his gospel, right after Jesus' miracle of changing water into wine at a wedding. Now, if you're reading the gospel for the first time and reading this story, you might be surprised. Like I said just a little bit earlier, the Jesus described here is not the kind of Jesus that we create in our minds. We see portraits of Jesus with children. We see pictures of him laughing or praying on his own. We don't like to see Jesus as an angry person flipping tables. We don't like a version of Jesus that disrupts with a temper tantrum and creating chaos. All that was happening outside of the temple in this time was very normal. It was a normal practice. Animals were being sold because they were necessary to temple practice. There were many laws of animal sacrifice, and so those who were coming to worship didn't carry around cattle or sheep or doves, obviously, so they brought them with them to the temple so that they could then make their sacrifice. It made sense that it was right there. It was very convenient. And Jesus is disrupting a very normal process, their normal way of life, but a process that he believes doesn't belong outside of the temple. So there are a few ways that we can explore this story and appreciate it, but I just want to highlight 2 different ways. John always has so much to discover and uncover, and so there's no way to get through all of it. But the first way that we can look at this is the way that it pulls at our justice-striving hearts. Whenever we feel really passionate about something that is wrong, we can justify our anger by pointing to Jesus in this story. He's stirring things up. He's flipping the systems of the day on their heads. The temple was a very complex institution. For Israel, the temple was God's permanent dwelling place and a sign of God's covenantal promise. And so all of the sacrificial rites were administered by priests, and many pilgrims came to the temple as part of their pilgrimage during feast times. But the priests were not the religious leaders of the people in the way that we might expect them to be. They were run by Roman rule, and they weren't autonomous in their authority. Roman officials appointed the chief priest who would serve for their own interest, for the interest of Rome and not for the people. And so Rome benefited from this marketplace, especially during a time like Passover when this was, which greatly boosted their revenue by so many people coming. And so Jesus disrupts all of that. And there are things today that I also believe need to be disrupted and stirred up. Jesus takes this whip of cords to drive out all of those who were exploiting the spiritual practice of the Jewish people to enrich themselves. They weren't interested in religious rituals. They were interested in making a living through corruption. And so as Christians, I think we also should speak about injustice. And that might be your takeaway from this. It's really a good takeaway. But I want to push us just a little further today. Because sometimes in our righteous anger, we can forget that as we speak out, we also need to raise up those things that need to be put in place of that which is destroyed. And so I believe the second way that we can explore this is to look closely at what John says. The other gospel writers quote Jesus as calling the temple a den of robbers, but John doesn't say that. I don't know if you picked it up. Jesus, according to John, says that the temple has become a marketplace. Now, this gospel was written long after Jesus' death, quite some time after the Roman Empire destroyed the temple in Jerusalem a second time. This was written after all of that. And so if we know that, if we picture in our minds the temple already being destroyed once John was written and people were reading it, it gives us new meaning to Jesus' words, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." From John's point of view, the temple is now obsolete now that Jesus has come. We worship Jesus who lived, who died, and who rose again. And our primary story of our faith is about rising up from death. And so I believe more than this story being about calling out exploitation, Jesus is encouraging us to not be afraid of death, whether it's the death of someone or the death of things in life. And Jesus is calling us to be more concerned about what can be risen up in the aftermath of destruction. Sometimes I think we can spend so much energy on stopping the inevitable instead of being ready to raise up the next thing that's coming. I think that churches have a lot of rich history. And when I was growing up, I wasn't really much interested in history classes. They bored me, and I didn't enjoy them. But since I have become more a part of the local church and a pastor, I love learning the history of congregations and the stories of the past. Excuse me. Linglestown Life is a story of two church communities who have incredible stories of faith, of persevering through decline and storms and floods. Two church communities who have persevered through all of that, but who also know what it's like to love their community and to love one another well. Our story is one of two church communities who decided that they would be better together than they could ever be apart. And we started that dream back in 2019. And that dream that we had does not look like it is today. But we are still better together than we could ever be apart. And each one of you here is a beautiful part of that community. Our history is amazing. I love hearing the stories that so many have told me that make you laugh. It's made me laugh. And you cry, it's made me cry. Sometimes we want to just go back to the way that it was. And when I hear those stories, I'm like, gosh, I wish I was around for that. That is so awesome. But I heard this question years ago that haunts me today when I think about going back to the way that it used to be. And that question is this: is God calling the church to be merely historical? Or is God calling the church, is God calling us to be history-making? Is God calling the church to be historical? Or is God calling the church to be history-making? What might God be calling us to raise up in this new season? Some of you may or may not remember that I actually preached on this passage in my second Sunday here with all of you back in July. If you don't remember, it's okay, because I didn't remember until I was preparing for this sermon. I had forgotten about it. But back then, I talked about God not being confined to a temple, that Jesus coming to be with us, as John says, the Word was made flesh and dwelled among us, means that our worship and church is not confined to a building. And so I think one of the ways that we find God is calling us to raise up is not by confining ourselves to our building, and especially not confining ourselves to the traditional ways of doing or being church. Some of you may remember me talking about it then, but back in November, there were a few of us who went to a conference that was hosted by our conference, Susquehanna, and Western Pennsylvania and Eastern PA. We went to Pittsburgh, and the conference was called Level Up. It was focused on creating new places for new people. And one of the keynote speakers challenged us to think of a place in our community, a certain type of culture or subculture of our community, where we might want to sit and listen, and what we might hear if we do that. And so this speaker then broke us off to discuss what kind of culture or subculture we would pick with the people in our church that we were there with. And so we talked about going down on the corner to the Eagle, right? That might be interesting to sit in there and what we would hear. Others agree, obviously. We thought about Mellow Minded. That's one of my favorite restaurants now. Or St. Thomas Roasters, where I like to go sometimes to work. A few hours, though, sitting in some place, listening, can tell you so much about a community when you pay attention. And so I wonder, if I were to ask you the same question, what subculture of Linglestown would you choose? Where might God be calling you to listen more intently and to discover where God is and what God is doing or raising up? Now, I know a lot of us, myself included, don't have, hours to waste somewhere. If you do, wonderful. This assignment is for you. But if you don't, maybe it's where you already are, in your own workplace or your break room or your gym or where you go to get your coffee or your favorite lunch spot. Maybe it's the sidelines of the field as you're waiting for your kids to get off of practice, or with other parents as your kids are playing. What might you notice in those places, and where might you see God in those places as you listen and take note of what's happening? Maybe it's not a specific place that you need to spend time in, but maybe there's a disruption happening in your life or the life of someone else, even better, that maybe you can see where God is calling you to find how God is at work even in the midst of that disruption, and how you might join God in that. There's one more story that I want to share with you. It's about oyster shells. Maybe some of you have known this for a long time. I just learned it recently. Did you know that an oyster that has not been wounded in any way cannot produce pearls? If an oyster has been untouched or unwounded, pearls are not produced inside of it. Pearls are a product of disruption. There's a foreign or an unwanted substance that enters the oyster like a parasite or a grain of sand, and when that happens, calcium carbonate, this shiny substance in the oyster, goes to work to try to cover that disruption over and over and over again with layers to protect it from the oyster. And as a result, a beautiful pearl is formed. Now, that could take 6 months, could take 4 years if you're trying to make a really big pearl, with people that harvest these often forced to happen. It takes time, though, and patience for that beauty to be created. But it's all because of disruption. What if our greatest moments could come from our greatest disruptions? What if our greatest moments could come from our greatest disruptions? There are some great moments happening here at Linglestown Life. And each week during the season of Lent, we want to share with you some of the good happening in our own community. And so as we get ready to celebrate communion together, to remember the beauty that came out of a disruption in life, I want you to watch this video and see the good that's happening here, right in Janie's Place with our cafe community.
The Cafe is a weekday hospitality ministry welcoming our LCNS families. Our Christian preschool parents, grandparents, caregivers, and siblings gather here to connect with each other. The Cafe, simply put, is a place where encouragement for life's daily struggles can be found, where smiles and laughter abound, a place where no trouble or joy is too big or too small to be shared, where weekday Bible studies fellowship over a cup of coffee, a place where friendships begin and blossom between various ages and stages of life, where hugs and prayers are always available, a place where local charities and community programs are spotlighted, where younger siblings are cared for while their parents escort students to class, a place where parents can work remotely, where fun photo opportunities pop up, where grace is given and love is shown, connections, friendships, conversations, prayers, laughter, relationships. Yes, all of this is the Cafe ministry. Oh, and there are hot beverages and tasty treats too.